The morning fog curled around the cracked pavement as city workers dragged Eleanor Whitmore's old furniture out of apartment 12B. Her floral armchair toppled onto the wet sidewalk, its fabric darkening under the drizzle. David Clark stood nearby, barking into his phone, ignoring the growing crowd. Cameras flashed, murmurs rose, and yet Eleanor stood still, her thin hands clasped around a small silver key, her gaze steady on the crumbling brick above her. Sarah Lopez watched from behind her lens, something uneasy stirring within her. The woman wasn't protesting, wasn't pleading. She was waiting, and in that quiet defiance, something about the scene felt inverted, like the story was being told backwards. As Eleanor whispered to the wind, "They never did read the fine print," Sarah leaned forward, realizing this eviction was not an ending, but the beginning of something no one yet understood. By noon, the rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with damp concrete and disbelief. Sarah stood beside Marcus, reviewing the footage. Every frame of Eleanor's calmness unsettled her. "She's not afraid," Marcus murmured beneath the hum of passing cars. Across the street, David Clark signed papers, pretending not to notice the whispers. Eleanor sat on her floral armchair, now stranded on the curb like a relic. Her eyes followed a sparrow hopping through puddles, serene, almost amused. "You're taking this remarkably well," Sarah said softly. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Child, when they try to take what's yours, sometimes it's better to let them, just so they can see what they never truly owned." Sarah froze, unsure if she'd just heard resignation or prophecy. The wind carried sirens in the distance, but the heartbeat of the story had already begun. Inside the nearly emptied apartment, the paint peeled from the walls like memory shedding its skin. David Clark walked through with Harold Finch, both inspecting the hollowed rooms. "We'll list it by Monday," David muttered, tone sharp. Harold's eyes lingered on a framed photograph left on the sill, a young Eleanor shaking hands with the mayor at the building's dedication. The brass plate beneath read Whitmore Residences, in honor of Eleanor Whitmore. His chest tightened. "She's been here longer than anyone," he murmured. David didn't look up. Then, in its time, she moved on. Outside, Sarah's lens caught the window's reflection. David's silhouette beside Eleanor's forgotten photo. Two eras collided in one frame: arrogance and legacy, blindness and truth. Back at the newsroom, screens glowed like restless eyes. Sarah scrolled through property records, the hum of keyboards surrounding her. The eviction replayed on her monitor, Eleanor's silver key glinting in slow motion. Something about it whispered of ownership, not loss. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, coffee steaming between them. "You..." Sarah nodded. "People like her don't just live in places like that. They build them." She typed faster, pulse quickening, until an archived deed surfaced. "Whitmore Building, property of Eleanor Whitmore Trust, 1938. She froze, breath catching. "She's not the tenant," Sarah whispered. "She's the landlord." The truth sat heavy, a quiet explosion in the glow of the screen. Evening settled over Boston like a tired confession. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement as Eleanor stood before her building, silver key turning slowly in her hand. Sarah and Marcus approached from across the street, cameras lowered now in respect rather than pursuit. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah began. "Is it true you own this building?" Eleanor's eyes softened. "Own?" she echoed, smiling faintly. "No, dear. I've merely taken care of it longer than most." David appeared at the doorway, his arrogance drained by the truth he could no longer deny. The silence between them was heavy, not of anger, but realization. "You cannot evict what's already yours," Eleanor murmured, turning her gaze skyward. The neon glow reflected in her eyes made her look eternal, not broken, but complete. The following morning, sunlight slanted through the newsroom blinds, slicing the air into bands of gold and shadow. Sarah Lopez's desk was buried in printouts, deeds, and yellowed city records that smelled faintly of dust and secrets. Marcus Reed hovered nearby, coffee in hand, watching her pace. Every thread leads back to her. Sarah murmured, circling dates and signatures with a red pen. Eleanor Whitmore has owned that building for over 70 years. Marcus frowned. Then why was she being evicted? The question hung heavy, unanswered. Across town, David Clark sat in his car outside his office, staring at his reflection in the window. The confident broker, now looking like a man unsure of his own footing. In the distance, Eleanor walked her quiet morning route, the same calm stride of someone who had already forgiven the noise of the world. The balance was shifting, though no one yet knew in whose favor. Sarah's call to the city records office went unanswered twice before an elderly clerk finally answered. "Property deeds." "Yes, I remember that name." The voice crackled. "Eleanor Whitmore. The one who built half the South End." The revelation hit harder than expected. Sarah scribbled notes as the clerk explained how Eleanor's late husband had left the property to her in full ownership, how she'd quietly maintained it without raising rent for decades. Meanwhile, across town, David sat with Harold Finch in the firm's glass office, his voice tight. "We can't let this go public. If she really owns it, we're finished." Harold rubbed his temples. "Maybe it's time to tell the truth." Their eyes met. One man seeking control, the other absolution. Outside, a storm gathered over the city skyline, its reflection flashing like an omen across their polished table. That afternoon, Sarah and Marcus arrived at Eleanor's modest corner cafe, a quiet refuge she'd owned for years without advertising it. The smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air, and soft jazz hummed from an old radio. Eleanor, dressed in a faded lavender blouse, sat near the window reading the paper. "I suppose you've discovered everything by now," she said calmly, not looking up. Sarah nodded. "Why didn't you stop them?" Eleanor folded the newspaper gently. "Because sometimes the world only listens after it's seen what cruelty looks like." Her words landed like a truth too big for headlines. Marcus adjusted his camera, but hesitated to film. For a moment, the three sat in the soft hum of the cafe, the light catching dust motes that drifted like time itself, fragile, suspended, real. Back at the firm, David Clark's composure cracked. The reporters' inquiries had reached corporate headquarters, and calls from investors flooded his phone. "They're saying, we evicted the owner," he hissed, voice trembling. Harold Finch stood by the window watching rain streak the glass. "You did," he said softly. "We both did." David slammed a fist against the desk. "You think she'll sue?" Harold turned, weary but resolute. "No, she'll forgive you. That's what will destroy you." Outside, lightning illuminated the skyline, casting the office in pale blue flashes. Somewhere below, the first online article published under Sarah's belief. The woman they tried to evict. It began with one line that silenced every reader who scrolled. They didn't know the home they stole already belonged to her. Night fell heavy and quiet. Eleanor sat on her balcony overlooking the street, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders as the city pulsed below. The air smelled of rain and redemption. Sarah's article had gone viral. Reporters gathered outside the Whitmore building, but Eleanor ignored the cameras. Instead, she watched the lights flicker in the apartments she had once protected, hearing laughter through open windows. Marcus filmed from across the street, voiceover steady. "Justice doesn't always roar," he said. "Sometimes it whispers." In the voice of a woman who waited long enough to be heard, Eleanor looked up at the stars, her silver key resting beside a teacup. "Let them talk," she murmured. "Truth doesn't need defense, only time." Her eyes shimmered as the city exhaled around her, finally beginning to understand who she truly was. The morning after Sarah's exposé broke, the city's skyline glimmered under news choppers and outrage. Headlines sprawled across screens. elderly woman evicted from her own building. David Clark's office buzzed like a hornet's nest, phones ringing with threats, apologies, and lawsuits. "We need to control the narrative," David snapped, pacing as his reflection fractured across the glass wall. Harold Finch remained silent, his conscience already half broken. Meanwhile, Sarah sat at her desk in the newsroom, phone lighting up with interview requests and corporate denials. "They'll twist it," Marcus warned. "They'll make her look unstable." Sarah nodded, jaw tight. "Then we'll show them what real instability looks like. Truth." Outside, the Whitmore building stood proud against the dawn, its plaque freshly polished by someone unseen. By noon, a sleek black car arrived at the newsroom, its tinted windows reflecting the storm Sarah had stirred. A man in a gray suit handed her a sealed envelope, a cease and desist order. Marcus read it aloud, disbelief tightening his voice. "They're threatening to sue you for defamation." Sarah laughed bitterly. "You can't defame the truth." Yet beneath her defiance, unease lingered. Across town, David met with the firm's board, desperate to salvage his career. "If we lose her property, we lose everything," one executive hissed. David's eyes flicked to a photograph on the wall. The building he once saw as a transaction now haunted him as a monument to greed. "Maybe," he muttered, "it's already lost." His voice trembled, an admission not meant to be heard. That evening, the city streets shimmered with neon and rain. Sarah parked outside Eleanor's cafe, finding the old woman wiping down tables like nothing had changed. "They're coming after me now," Sarah said quietly. Eleanor smiled, unbothered. "That's what they do when truth frightens them." She poured tea, the steam curling like ghosts between them. "You mustn't fear them, Sarah. You must remind them who they're dealing with." Her tone carried the authority of someone who'd built empires quietly. Sarah sipped her tea, absorbing the calm. "You're not afraid they'll come for you again?" Eleanor chuckled softly. "My dear, they've been coming for me my whole life. But I built the doors they're knocking on." Back at the firm, desperation took shape in deceit. David Clark met with a corporate lawyer under flickering fluorescent lights. "We'll frame it as a misunderstanding," the lawyer said. "Claimed she signed over partial rights decades ago." David swallowed hard. "She didn't." "Then we'll make it look like she did," the lawyer replied. The words hung like poison. Harold Finch entered quietly, holding a folder. "You'll want to see this," he said. Inside were scanned copies of the original ownership documents, notarized, intact, undeniable. "She never transferred a thing," Harold said, voice trembling. David looked at the evidence, realization breaking through denial. The lawyer muttered, "If this goes public, we're finished." David exhaled shakily. "We already are." The next morning, Sarah prepared for a live broadcast outside the Whitmore building. The air was electric. Reporters, neighbors, even city officials filled the street. Eleanor emerged from the entrance, dressed in her signature shawl, calm and composed. Cameras flashed as Sarah began her report. What began as an eviction has become an exposure of deceit. Behind them, David watched from across the street, his face hollow, understanding at last that power built on arrogance always crumbles. Eleanor turned, her voice carrying through the crowd. "Justice isn't revenge," she said softly. "It's revelation." Applause rose as the morning sun broke through the clouds, flooding the old brick with light. Sarah met Eleanor's eyes and whispered, "You won." Eleanor's reply was gentle but firm. "No, dear. We all just remembered who truly owns what." The calm after revelation lasted less than a day. By nightfall, headlines began twisting the truth, anonymous sources painting Eleanor as delusional, unfit, and confused. Sarah stared at the smear campaign on her monitor, fury tightening her chest. Marcus paced behind her. "They're going after her reputation now," he muttered. "They can't win in court, so they'll try the court of public opinion." Sarah clenched her jaw. "Then we fight back there too, across town." David Clark sat alone in his penthouse, scrolling through the same headlines, his reflection fractured in the glass. The guild had grown louder than the city below. Meanwhile, Eleanor rested in her apartment, lights dimmed, listening to the faint buzz of distant news anchors trying to rewrite her story. Again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. A week later, Sarah received an anonymous email titled, "They're setting you up." It contained a scanned document, an altered deed showing Eleanor's signature forged on a transfer form. Her pulse quickened as she printed the file, the edges trembling in her hands. Marcus leaned in. "This is how they'll try to bury it. Make her look like a fraud." Sarah's eyes burned. "Not on my watch." Across the city, in a dim boardroom, David confronted his superiors. "You forged her signature?" Silence answered him. The CEO smiled coldly. "We corrected a clerical error." David slammed his hand on the table. "You corrected morality." He stormed out into the rain, the sound of thunder chasing him down the marble corridor. That night, Sarah drove to Eleanor's apartment. The old woman greeted her with a calm smile, as if expecting her. "They've forged your name," Sarah said breathlessly, showing her the printout. Eleanor studied it quietly, her eyes narrowing not in fear, but recognition. Harold warned me once," she whispered. "Said I'd rather fake the truth than face it." She placed the paper aside, unshaken. "Let them dig deeper. The roots are mine." Sarah sat beside her, heart heavy but steadied by Eleanor's resolve. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. But inside, peace held firm. The kind that only comes from knowing one's truth cannot be rewritten, only revealed in time. Meanwhile, Harold Finch arrived unannounced at Sarah's newsroom carrying a worn leather folder. "You'll want to see this," he said quietly. Inside were original copies of the Whitmore Trust, unaltered, notarized, sealed by the city clerk himself. Sarah's eyes widened. "This proves everything." Harold nodded. "I can't stay silent anymore." At that same moment, David Clark faced the firm's executives, his resignation letter trembling in his hand. "You built your empire on lies," he said, voice breaking. The CEO smirked. "And you helped." David turned, walking away from the table without another word, leaving the room and his career in ruins, but his conscience intact for the first time in years. 2 nights later, Sarah went live with the new evidence. Her voice trembled slightly as she held up the original trust documents on camera. "The Whitmore building was never sold, never transferred, never lost," she declared. "It was stolen on paper and reclaimed by truth." Viewers across the country watched as screenshots flooded social media. Eleanor stood in her living room, watching quietly, her reflection flickering in the television glow. Outside her window, reporters gathered once more, not to question her this time, but to honor her. David watched too, seated in a half-packed apartment, tears forming as he realized redemption sometimes arrives disguised as exposure. And in that moment, justice didn't roar or whisper. It simply was. The storm broke over Boston like a final warning. Carnscherzi to North Shore trial. The day after Sarah's live broadcast, the network received an urgent directive. Corporate sponsors wanted her segment pulled, her sources reviewed. Inside the newsroom, tension buzzed like static. "They're trying to silence you," Marcus warned. Sarah didn't look up from her screen. "Then they'll have to shout louder than the truth." Across the city, Eleanor's phone rang off the hook. Journalists, lawyers, strangers thanking her for standing up. But with fame came shadows. A car lingered too long outside her building. and late-night calls came from blocked numbers. In a glass office miles away, the CEO of Clark and Rowe leaned forward with cold precision. "If the old woman wants stop," he said, "well, make her." His assistant hesitated. "You mean legally?" The CEO's smile never reached his eyes. "Whichever way works." By dusk, Eleanor returned home to find a formal notice taped to her door. An investigative audit claiming she owed back taxes on her own property. She read it once, then twice, a small laugh escaping her lips. "They never learn," she whispered. Moments later, Sarah arrived, clutching files from the city archives. "They're fabricating debt, Eleanor. They're trying to scare you into settling." Eleanor's eyes glinted. "Fear is for those who doubt their ground. I built mine." Her voice was quiet, but immovable. Marcus filmed discreetly from the doorway, capturing the rare strength of a woman who refused to yield. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the old bricks. But inside, Eleanor stood firm, as if the entire building drew its strength from her presence. The following morning, Sarah arrived at work to find her desk cleared. Her supervisor, a nervous man with trembling hands, handed her a termination letter. "Corporate directive," he stammered. "You went off script." The words felt like ice. Marcus slammed his camera bag onto the floor. "You can't fire the only one telling the truth." But Sarah barely blinked. "They fired my paycheck, not my voice." Outside, rain streaked the newsroom glass as she stepped into the storm, jobless but unbroken. Across town, David Clark watched from his apartment, news of her firing playing on television. He turned off the sound, the silence deafening. "They're destroying the only honest person in the city," he muttered. For the first time, he realized that staying silent was no longer neutrality, it was complicity. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment. The city's hum fading beneath the storm's rhythm. She opened an old trunk, revealing handwritten letters, blueprints, and ledgers dating back to the 1940s. Proof that every stone, every window, every repaired brick of the Whitmore building had been funded by her. The building wasn't just hers, legally. It was hers, spiritually. She placed the documents in a neat stack and whispered, "Let them try to erase this." Across town, Sarah and Marcus prepared an independent report, planning to release it online. "They can't silence the internet," Marcus said. Sarah smiled faintly. "They can try, but truth travels faster than fear." The glow from their laptop illuminated tired but determined faces. Warriors of words armed with evidence and conviction. Midnight came with a flicker. The city momentarily lost power, then roared back to life. Online, Sarah's independent expose went live. The title read simply, "The Building That Fought Back." Within minutes, thousands shared it. The footage showed forged documents, real deeds, Eleanor's legacy, and David Clark's confession. The truth was now unstoppable. In her apartment, Eleanor watched quietly as the views climbed, her eyes shimmering with something between pride and peace. Down the street, David turned off his phone and stepped into the night, walking toward the Whitmore building. No cameras, no headlines, just a man seeking forgiveness. For the first time, the city seemed to pause, listening, learning, awakening. The city awoke to headlines that couldn't be silenced. Sarah's expose had gone viral overnight. Major outlets picked it up, while protesters gathered outside Clark and Rowe's downtown headquarters. "Justice for Eleanor," echoed through the streets, their chants rising like thunder between glass towers. Sarah watched from the crowd's edge, camera in hand, tears of exhaustion streaking her face. Marcus filmed silently beside her, the lens trembling under the weight of history. Inside, David Clark faced the boardroom for the last time. resignation letter in one hand, truth in the other. "You built your empire on deceit," he said. "And now the foundation's giving way." As he left the building, reporters swarmed, not with accusations, but applause. The city had chosen its side, and for once, it wasn't the powerful. At City Hall, Eleanor Whitmore entered the marble chamber, flanked by her attorney and the city clerk. Her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The mayor extended a trembling hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began. "On behalf of Boston, we apologize." Eleanor's expression softened. "Don't apologize to me," she said gently. "Apologize to everyone you didn't believe." Flashbulbs erupted as she signed a new charter officially reinstating her ownership of the Whitmore building. Reporters shouted questions, but she answered only one. "What will you do now?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "The same thing I've always done. Take care of what's mine." Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers that rolled down the streets like a wave of redemption. As the city celebrated, David Clark stood before a live television audience, his voice steady but remorseful. "I participated in something unjust," he admitted. "But truth doesn't vanish just because we bury it." Mrs. Whitmore reminded us of that. The confession aired across the nation, transforming him from villain to witness. Meanwhile, Sarah watched from her apartment, exhaustion melting into quiet satisfaction. "You did it," Marcus said softly. She shook her head. "No, she did." Across town, Eleanor brewed tea by her window, the city skyline glowing with a rare peace. The sound of protest had turned into conversation, the noise into understanding. Justice, at last, felt less like punishment and more like balance restored. Weeks later, the Whitmore building buzzed with life again. Families moved back in, laughter echoing through hallways that had once carried fear. Eleanor stood in the lobby, watching children race past the marble columns. Sarah and Marcus arrived, cameras in hand, this time not to expose, but to celebrate. "Feels different now," Marcus said. Sarah smiled. "Because it's honest." Eleanor turned toward them, eyes bright. "Truth has a sound, you know. It's quieter than lies, but it lasts longer." They shared a soft laugh as sunlight streamed through the restored stained glass window above the entrance. The one Eleanor had commissioned 70 years ago. The building had survived greed, storms, and time. Now it simply lived again. On a crisp autumn evening, Eleanor sat on a park bench overlooking the Whitmore building, now gleaming under twilight. Sarah joined her quietly, notebook in hand. "What will you do now that it's over?" she asked. Eleanor's gaze stayed on the skyline. "It's never over," she said softly. "Justice isn't an event. It's a way of living." She handed Sarah the silver key. "The same one from the day of her eviction. Keep it," she said, "a reminder that truth belongs to those who protect it." Sarah's eyes glistened as she accepted it, the weight of legacy settling in her palm. As night descended, city lights reflected in Eleanor's eyes, steady and timeless. The wind carried her final whisper. "They thought they took my home. Turns out, they just built my story." Winter returned to Boston wrapped in quiet snowfall, softening the city that once screamed for justice. The Whitmore building glowed like a lantern in the storm, every window alive with warmth and laughter. Inside, a community dinner was underway, tenants sharing food and stories, their voices echoing through halls, once filled with fear. At the center of it all sat Eleanor Whitmore, her shawl drawn tight, her smile serene. "You see," she said, raising a cup of tea, "the real reward of justice is belonging." Sarah filmed from across the room, tears threatening as she realized this wasn't a story anymore. It was history being lived. The snow fell thicker outside, blanketing the street where, not long ago, Eleanor's furniture had stood in the rain. The city had forgotten that day, but Sarah never would. A week later, Sarah visited Eleanor with a proposal. "The city wants to feature your story in the museums. Voices of Boston exhibit," she said. Eleanor chuckled, eyes sparkling. "Imagine that after all these years, they finally want to listen." She looked out the window at children building a snowman in the courtyard. "But tell them not to make it about loss," she added. "Make it about endurance." Sarah nodded, writing it down. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's what people forget. Endurance is the most elegant form of rebellion." The kettle whistled softly as Sarah looked around the apartment, the walls lined with photographs of neighbors past and present. Every picture whispered the same quiet truth. One woman's steadiness had held an entire world together. That night, Eleanor wrote her final letter. Her handwriting, though unsteady, carried the same grace as her voice. "To those who fight for fairness, remember, justice is not revenge. It's repair." She folded the page neatly and slipped it into an envelope addressed to Sarah. The next morning, the building was quiet. Sarah arrived early, camera in hand, only to find Harold Finch waiting by the door, hat in hand, eyes heavy with sorrow. "She passed in her sleep," he whispered. The world seemed to still. Sarah stepped inside, the scent of lavender tea lingering in the air, the silver key resting on Eleanor's bedside table beside the unopened letter she'd written herself. Titled, "The Keeper of Doors." The city mourned her as if losing one of its foundations. Crowds filled the street outside the Whitmore building, candles flickering in the cold wind. Sarah stood at the steps, voice trembling as she read Eleanor's final letter aloud. "You cannot evict kindness. You cannot foreclose humanity. And you cannot silence truth." Every line echoed off the brick walls. Each word carried upward into the winter sky. David Clark stood quietly among the crowd, head bowed, his guilt tempered by gratitude. Harold placed a single white rose at the foot of the steps. "She built more than a building," he whispered. "She built us." The wind picked up, scattering the candle flames like spirits rising toward light. Months later, spring sunlight poured across a bronze plaque newly mounted on the Whitmore building's entrance. It read, "In memory of Eleanor Whitmore, who reminded a city that justice lives in the hands that build it." Sarah filmed as children played nearby, their laughter echoing between the bricks Eleanor once fought to protect. Marcus adjusted the camera, his voice soft. "Think she'd be proud." Sarah smiled, holding the silver key around her neck. She already was. As the lens focused on the plaque, a soft breeze swept through, rustling leaves and carrying the scent of lilacs from the courtyard below. The city no longer whispered Eleanor's name. It carried it, like a promise etched into its very skyline. Justice had found its home, and it bore her name.